China now accounts for 60% of global electric vehicle sales. In fact, the world's largest EV maker today isn't Tesla or Volkswagen. It's BYD, a Chinese automaker whose name literally stands for Build Your Dreams. Late last year, BYD even overtook Tesla in EV production volume. This astonishing rise has stunned the auto industry. It also raises a provocative question. How much of BYD's success is organic, and how much is driven by Chinese state support? This question lies at the heart of debates about BYD's rapid ascent. BYD has grown from a little-known battery maker into an EV powerhouse. Is this growth built by dreams, as the company motto suggests, or built by Beijing through government subsidies and policy support? In other words, did BYD earn its crown through its own ingenuity, or was the playing field tilted by massive state backing? To find the truth, we need to explore how China's policies shaped the electric vehicle boom, what support BYD actually received, and whether its achievements come down to clever engineering or simply cash from the state. Let's start by looking at China's grand plan for electric cars that set the stage for BYD's rise. China did not become the world's largest EV market by accident. In the 2010s, the Chinese government launched an aggressive push to promote new energy vehicles, NEVs, a term that includes battery electric cars, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell vehicles. Why? The country faced choking air pollution, high oil imports, and a desire to lead in new high-tech industries. Electric vehicles were seen as a strategic solution. Beijing rolled out a new energy vehicle program with generous incentives to kickstart domestic demand. As early as 2010, the central government began offering consumer subsidies up to 60,000 yuan, about $9,000, for a pure electric car and 50,000 yuan for a plug-in hybrid. At the time, that subsidy could cover nearly half the cost of a typical EV, an enormous boost to entice buyers. Only certain approved models qualified, a move that favored local manufacturers by requiring use of government-approved battery tech. In addition to cash rebates, buyers enjoyed perks like exemption from the 10% vehicle purchase tax. The message was clear: if you choose an electric car, the government will heavily chip in. Local governments amplified the effect with their own incentives. For example, Shanghai offered free license plates for EVs. In cities like Shanghai, winning the right to a gasoline car plate can cost upwards of 100,000 yuan, about $14,500, at auction. By waiving those fees for EVs, Shanghai effectively gave EV buyers a gift as valuable as a small car. In Beijing, the city government in 2014 began matching the national EV subsidy yuan for yuan, doubling the discount consumers received. Other cities provided free parking for EVs or guaranteed registration quotas for electric cars. These measures shaped consumer demand by making EVs far cheaper and easier to own than conventional cars. The results of these policies were dramatic. Electric car sales in China surged from virtually nothing into the hundreds of thousands within a few years. By 2015, EV and plug-in hybrid sales quadrupled to 351,000 units nationwide. BYD was quick to seize the opportunity. Its popular Qin and Tang models, plug-in hybrids, rode this wave of demand. BYD sold about 58,000 NEVs in 2015, grabbing roughly 80% of China's plug-in hybrid market. The company's timing was perfect. China's leaders had made NEVs a centerpiece of the nation's 5-year plans, high-level economic roadmaps, as a way to combat the environmental nightmare of pollution. In other words, BYD found itself in the right industry at the right time, just as Beijing opened the subsidy floodgates to encourage electric mobility. China deployed a toolkit of subsidies and policies to cultivate its electric vehicle sector, benefiting companies like BYD. These tools took both direct and indirect forms. Consumer purchase rebates. The most visible support was cash subsidies to car buyers, as discussed. From 2010 onward, buyers of qualifying EVs received hefty rebates at purchase, funded by the government. In Beijing and some regions, local subsidies doubled the effect. This directly lowered the price of BYD's electric models for consumers, boosting sales. However, these purchase subsidies were meant to phase out as the market matured, and indeed, by 2023, the central government had fully eliminated direct EV purchase rebates, after tapering them down in 2019 to 2022. Tax breaks. The government waived the 10% vehicle purchase tax for new energy vehicles, a significant saving for buyers. This policy has been extended multiple times and remains a way to make EVs more affordable. Sales tax exemptions in 2022 amounted to roughly 88 billion yuan, $13 billion, in foregone taxes. BYD and its customers benefited because every sale of a BYD EV incurred no sales tax, whereas a gasoline car did. Direct grants to manufacturers. Behind the scenes, automakers received direct support for producing EVs. BYD, in particular, emerged as a state-supported champion in the early 2000s. In the 5 years from 2010 to 2015, BYD received about 2.9 billion yuan, $435 million, in government grants and subsidies. That is an enormous sum, even in China, for a single private company. To put it in perspective, those subsidies equaled roughly 45% of BYD's total net profits over the same period. In some lean years, the government grants actually exceeded the company's profit. For instance, in 2012, BYD got 550 million yuan in subsidies against only 213 million yen in net income. Such support helped BYD stay afloat and invest in R&D during its formative years in the EV market. R&D funding and industrial programs. The central government set aside huge funds for EV technology development. Under the 2012 to 2020 Energy Saving and New Energy Vehicle Development Plan, over $15 billion was allocated for EV innovation, pilot projects, and infrastructure. BYD, with its Shenzhen roots in battery tech, tapped into some of these research grants and innovation programs. Made in China 2025, a national industrial strategy, also identified electric vehicles as a priority sector to achieve global leadership. This strategic importance meant BYD's EV and battery projects were more likely to receive government science and technology grants or other financial incentives aimed at building domestic champions. Low-interest loans and cheap land. Some of the indirect subsidies are less visible, but just as critical. Chinese state-owned banks and local governments often provided automakers with access to capital on favorable terms. For example, in 2022, the average interest rate on loans to the auto manufacturing sector was around 2%, roughly half the typical commercial loan rate. Getting credit that cheaply is a huge advantage for a manufacturing firm. BYD could finance new factories and expansion at minimal cost thanks to state-directed lending. Likewise, local authorities often offered discounted land or even free land for new EV plants, plus subsidies on electricity for factories. While hard to quantify, these supports lower the operating costs for companies like BYD. A recent World Bank report noted that such below-market loans and resources are significant and could be critical for some individual EV makers. Government procurement and contracts. The Chinese government didn't only incentivize private buyers, it also directly bought fleets of electric vehicles for public use. Mandates required government agencies, public transit, and state companies to prefer NEVs for new purchases. BYD, which produces electric buses and taxis, benefited from lucrative contracts to supply e-buses to Chinese cities. When a municipal transit system orders hundreds of e-buses, often with subsidies covering a portion of the cost, companies like BYD reap the revenue. These guaranteed markets gave BYD volume and stability. In its home city of Shenzhen, for example, the entire bus fleet eventually became electric, many of them BYD made. China's multi-pronged approach, tax breaks, consumer rebates, R&D grants, cheap financing, and state purchasing, created an environment in which domestic EV makers were essentially nurtured from infancy to adolescence with a safety net. BYD capitalized on this environment masterfully. But to truly understand BYD's rise, we have to look not just at the support it received, but at what the company did with that support. The next step is to examine BYD's growth and how it compares with rivals, both within China and abroad. China's generous policies set the stage, but BYD still needed to build products people wanted. The company did exactly that, combining government boosts with its own innovations. The result was explosive growth. Consider this. Back in 2020, BYD held only about 1.8% of the Chinese auto market. By 2023, it had leapt to 11% share, becoming the largest auto company in China and the world's top EV producer by volume. Such a meteoric rise was no accident. It was the product of both strategic planning and market forces. Observers often quip that BYD's success was spurred by a combination of central planning and free market economics. What does that mean? On one hand, central planning created the demand, through subsidies and mandates as we saw. On the other hand, BYD still had to win in the free market of consumers' choice, especially as competition in China intensified. In the early 2020s, authorities at national and local levels rolled out a deluge of incentives for EVs and plug-in hybrids. These made electric cars often significantly cheaper than equivalent gasoline cars, in some cases even cheaper than the cost of obtaining a license plate for a gas car in cities like Shanghai. Not surprisingly, sales of EVs absolutely exploded in China when buying an electric car became not just green, but economically smart. Yet subsidies alone don't explain why BYD outpaced both foreign rivals and domestic startups. To crack that mystery, we should note a few distinct advantages BYD cultivated. 1. Battery technology. Leadership. BYD began in 1995 as a battery manufacturer, and this DNA proved invaluable. The company invested heavily in its own battery chemistry and production. It developed the Blade battery, a revolutionary lithium iron phosphate (LFP) battery design that debuted in 2020. The Blade battery was thinner, highly impact resistant, less prone to fires, and allowed more compact battery packs. Crucially, LFP chemistry uses no costly nickel or cobalt, making it cheaper. By mastering LFP batteries, BYD could produce affordable EVs with decent range, a key to cracking the mass market. This vertical integration, BYD makes its own batteries, chips, and even electric motors, let BYD lower costs in a way that foreign automakers who rely on suppliers could not easily match. In practical terms, BYD could undercut competitors on price without sacrificing too much on performance. 2. Full spectrum of models. Unlike Tesla, which started with luxury cars, BYD flooded the market with models at every price point. It sells everything from the Seagull, a mini electric hatchback costing under $10,000, to high-end luxury EVs. This broad lineup meant BYD could scoop up demand wherever it emerged, from budget-conscious first-time buyers to taxi fleets to tech-savvy premium customers. And thanks to subsidies, many of these models became incredibly enticing deals. For example, a few years ago, Volkswagen's entry-level EV, the ID.3, was priced around $23,000 in China, while BYD's small EVs like the Seagull were available for roughly half that price. Even though the Seagull had a shorter range and slower acceleration, it was close enough in specs and far cheaper. When an EV buyer could get a BYD with similar functionality for nearly half the cost of a foreign-branded EV, the choice often swung in BYD's favor. BYD also outcompeted domestic rivals by rapidly improving quality and features each year, leveraging its growing scale. 3. Rapid innovation cycles. BYD's approach has been described as moving at tech speed, not auto speed. new models and improvements come out fast. The company benefited from China's tech ecosystem and a willing domestic market to continually refine its products. Features like advanced driver assist, sleek user interfaces, and even quirky ideas. One BYD model has a built-in air purifier with UV virus killing. Tech, and even a car karaoke machine, helped BYD cars stand out. While subsidies created a market, BYD's constant innovation helped it win market share within that booming market. Foreign automakers found themselves on the back foot in China. By 2024, Volkswagen's EV sales were plunging in China, while BYD's were soaring. Simply put, BYD offered better value for money to Chinese consumers, who no longer saw Western brands as inherently superior as they once did. 4. Economy of scale and aggressive pricing. Thanks again to years of policy support, China ended up with dozens upon dozens of EV makers, over 200 producers at one point. This created a hyper-competitive home market. BYD emerged as a front-runner and could leverage scale to reduce costs further. By 2023, China's EV industry had built far more production capacity than even China could absorb. This overcapacity led to a fierce price war in 2023. BYD participated by slashing prices on its models, pressuring rivals, and Tesla, which also cut prices. Because BYD had support in its early years and had reached a profitable scale, it could better endure price cuts. Many smaller EV startups, less efficient and without deep coffers, were squeezed hard. In a true free market with no state involvement, so many players might never have been in the game to begin with. But China's subsidies kept some afloat longer than market fundamentals would dictate. BYD, however, proved it could thrive even as subsidies tapered off, thanks to the momentum and scale it had achieved. Multi-angle comparison, East versus West. It's also useful to compare China's approach with how other countries support EVs. The United States, for instance, has offered consumer tax credits for electric cars for years, but mostly limited ones. A $7,500 federal tax credit was available only up to a certain sales cap per manufacturer, a cap Tesla famously hit, ending its eligibility. In 2022, the US doubled down with the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, which revamped the credit up to $7,500 per electric vehicle with American-made batteries and assembly, and poured money into EV manufacturing. All told, the EV-related provisions of the IRA are estimated to cost $393 billion through 2032, a massive subsidy push by the US, albeit spread over a decade. Europe, on its part, traditionally offered incentives like purchase rebates or tax breaks in many countries. For example, Germany provided a €4,000 to €6,000 subsidy for EV buyers in recent years. But neither the US nor Europe matched the sheer scale and breadth of China's support in the 2010s. China spent at least $230 billion between 2009 and 2023 to build its EV industry. And that's a conservative figure, not even counting all local subsidies and supply chain investments. By comparison, other countries were slower and more modest in encouraging EV adoption until very recently. Interestingly, by 2023, the dynamic had shifted such that China's subsidy per EV was actually lower than America's. How so? China's support, while huge in total, was spread over a vast number of vehicles and was being phased down as the industry matured. One analysis showed that subsidies as a percentage of an EV's price fell from over 40% in the early years of China's program to just 11% of the vehicle cost in 2023. The average subsidy per EV in China dropped to about $4,800 in 2023, down from $13,000 plus 5 years earlier. The $4,800 per car is actually less than the $7,500 credit an American EV buyer can get under the IRA. In that sense, BYD in 2023 was competing with only modest home market subsidies relative to before. This adds weight to the argument that BYD's recent success isn't only about state support. The company's own competitive strengths are now front and center. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of 15 years of support is impossible to ignore. BYD might not need as much subsidy anymore because those subsidies helped it achieve scale and technological maturity. The story of BYD and China's EV industry has two sides, and it's important to consider the criticisms and potential downsides of the heavy-handed subsidy model, as well as the counterpoints defending BYD's merits. Let's examine a few. Foreign critics and unfair advantages. It didn't take long for foreign automakers and governments to cry foul. With Chinese EVs now making inroads overseas, there are loud complaints that these vehicles are artificially competitive. That is, their low prices are thanks to government subsidies and not purely market efficiency. In 2023, as Chinese brands like BYD began exporting more cars to Europe, the European Union launched an anti-subsidy investigation. By June 2024, the EU announced provisional tariffs ranging from 17.4% up to 38.1% on EVs imported from China, aiming to offset the unfair price advantage from subsidies. The European Commission concluded that Chinese EV makers benefited from state support, enough to justify these steep tariffs. This is a major escalation, essentially a trade barrier to protect European manufacturers from a flood of cheaper Chinese EVs. China's government blasted the move as protectionism, insisting that Chinese EVs are competitive due to natural advantages and hard work, not illegal subsidies. Trade tensions are heating up. The US has also taken steps, including a hefty 25% tariff on Chinese autos, and even floated 100% tariffs on some EVs. We are witnessing the start of a potential global EV subsidy war, where each side accuses the other of tilting the playing field. Market distortions at home. Inside China, analysts point out that years of subsidies have led to inefficiencies and bubbles. Thanks to easy money and local governments eager to have an EV success story, China ended up with too many EV startups, over 200 producers at the peak. Some companies existed solely to cash in on subsidies. There have been cases of fraud, where manufacturers claimed subsidies for vehicles that were never actually sold or used. The huge state support delayed the normal Darwinian shakeout of a competitive market. By the early 2020s, this became apparent. Capacity far outstripped demand in China's EV sector. Factories could make millions more cars than people were buying. The result? Inventory buildup and a bruising price war in 2023 that saw even major players like BYD and Tesla slashing prices to move units. In a healthier market, some weaker firms would have gone bankrupt by now, and production would better match demand. Instead, China may face a painful consolidation phase ahead, as the subsidy gravy train slows and many unprofitable EV makers can no longer survive. BYD itself remains profitable, but plenty of its domestic competitors are not, which raises concerns about an unstable industry reliant on continuous government life support. Dependency and sustainability. Another risk is whether companies like BYD have become too accustomed to state support. What happens if the music stops? China has indeed been dialing back certain subsidies, for example, eliminating consumer purchase rebates as of 2023. Will BYD continue its ascent if it must compete without home market buyer incentives? Early signs are cautiously positive for BYD. It has grown volumes and profits even after some subsidies were cut, partly by expanding overseas. But critics caution that the true test will come in a few years when the Chinese government's indirect support, like cheap loans or tax breaks, might also tighten. There is also the risk of backlash in export markets. If tariffs or trade barriers go up, as Europe is doing, BYD might find its global expansion throttled. BYD aims to sell in Europe, Australia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. But if its cars are hit with 20 to 30% import duties due to the stigma of subsidies, its price edge could vanish. This is a key uncertainty going forward. Protectionism versus innovation. Western commentators sometimes frame China's EV success as purely a product of protectionism. But that's only half the story. Yes, China protected and nurtured its EV industry with subsidies and rules, like requiring foreign automakers to form joint ventures and share technology for decades. However, China also genuinely innovated. BYD and peers are not just pumping out cheap, low-quality junk cars riding on free money. Their products are increasingly cutting-edge. BYD's vehicles compete on range, safety, and features, not only on price. It's telling that most of China's EV leaders today, BYD, NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, etc., are private companies rather than state-owned enterprises, and they developed a lot of their own technology. BYD's case demonstrates this nuance well. The company benefited from subsidies, yes, but it also created a superior battery technology, a strong brand, and a loyal customer base. As one analysis noted, Chinese EVs have benefited from both massive industrial policy support and improving quality. Both statements are true at the same time. Understanding this dual reality is important. If one only sees the subsidies, one might dismiss BYD's achievements unfairly. Conversely, if one only sees the shiny cars and global sales, one might ignore the fact that BYD's rise was not in a free market vacuum. The interplay of state support and entrepreneurial execution is what makes BYD's story unique.